Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. We are continuing with John Perry's dialogue on consciousness. The subtitle is Minds, Brains, and Zombies. Right. I didn't have my copy of the book when I started the last lecture, so I didn't hold it up, but there you go. That's what we're reading. Right, so this is the halfway point. We covered the Monday chapter last time. Now we need to cover Wednesday. The next lecture will cover the Friday lecture, and then that's the whole book. Okay, I'll remind you where we left off. Basically, Sam Miller and Gretchen Weirob are the two people with committed positions, right? Sam is committed to property dualism at this point. He started out a substance dualist, although he wasn't really making a distinction between different kinds of dualism, but that's how he started out, basically as a Cartesian. Now he's embraced property dualism. He thinks that works better. And then Gretchen entertained property dualism in the Monday chapter, but now she's back to physicalism. Sam Miller didn't say enough to convince her that she had to be a property dualist. So that needs to be taken into account. The setup of the dialogue is, Sam comes into it a dualist, and he's trying to see whether he needs to give up dualism. And then Gretchen comes into this a physicalist, and she's trying to see if there's any reason she needs to give up physicalism, basically. And, she had a hard time with basically subjective feels with qualia, although that word wasn't introduced in the Monday chapter. But that was the point of the red hot poker. A throbbing pain is very different from some kind of chemical molecular process in the brain. They're so different that we're certainly tempted to think the mind is something other than the brain, even though everyone has agreed at this point that the mind is caused by the brain. That's part of property dualism. That's built into property dualism, right? Anyway, Gretchen Weirob believes that she can just go on saying that, the physical processes of the brain cause mental phenomena, even though, mental phenomena aren't mechanical or material phenomena. So what we need is a broader definition of the physical, which Professor Weirob does not have on hand, but she has faith that it will be forthcoming. I suppose we could say Sam is in a similar situation. He doesn't have it worked out in detail how non-material properties can interact with material properties, even if they do share a physical substrate, namely the brain. He hasn't really offered a rich account of how that works. So perhaps they're a bit on a par there. Okay, so what happens in the Wednesday chapter? Well, Dave and Sam have been talking. Now, Dave Cohen, he's not really committed. As I said, Sam and Gretchen are the committed parties here. Dave is trying to help Sam articulate things and present them well to Gretchen, and then Gretchen kind of decides, is this a good argument? Is this a bad argument? Sometimes Dave will explain Gretchen's case to Sam, right? And often Dave is supporting Sam and explaining his case to Gretchen, right? So Dave is a sort of intermediary, right? Going between the two positions, sort of getting them to talk to each other, right? Anyway, Dave and Sam have been working together since the Monday meeting, and they've developed these two new arguments against physicalism. There's the zombie argument and there's the knowledge argument. So the Wednesday chapter is taken up with discussion of the zombie argument, and the Friday chapter will be taken up with discussion of the knowledge argument, right? So obviously we're focusing on zombies today, right? Okay, so Dave makes the opening salvo here. He invites us to imagine a world full of zombies, right? What are zombies? Well, they're beings just like us. Physically, they're just like us. That includes brains. They have brains, right? But they lack consciousness, right? And then I'll jump to the chase a little bit here and say, well, that means, in terms that all the characters agree on, that these zombies are incapable of having experiences, right? So these zombies are physically indiscernible from us. That word indiscernible gets thrown around a lot. Just means they're exactly like us physically indiscernible. Can't tell us apart physically. But they lack experiences, right? So the point is, if this world full of zombies is a possible world, then physicalism is false, right? It's that simple. It really is. I mean, we should elaborate, but it's that simple in its essence. The zombie world is a world full of beings who are physically identical to us, but they lack experience, and that seems conceivable. It seems imaginable. And if it's really possible, if it is as it seems, if it's really possible for that world to exist, then that means that our experiences aren't physical and aren't entailed by the physical, right? So it's possible that, our experiences are physical items themselves. It's possible that our experiences are sort of forced into existence by the physical processes. If either of those things were true, then in a world that's physically the same as ours, consciousness would be there, experiences would be there. So then if we say this world full of zombies with no consciousness could exist, then we're saying the physical world neither includes nor entails, in a necessary way, conscious experience. Okay, so then the chapter revolves around this issue of whether we can make sense of the zombie world. And again, jumping to the chase here, yeah, we can make sense of it, but then there turns out to be a big cost that wasn't expected going into it. Okay. So Dave puts it out there, hey, there's a zombie world, possibly a zombie world, therefore physicalism is false. Gretchen initially resists, of course. She says, look, you're talking about science fiction, right? Science fiction often deals with these possible or what we think are possible scenarios. You can't prove anything with science fiction. And then Dave says, now wait a minute. Philosophy, I'm going to start out with a general point. That's not really how Dave starts out, but that's okay. Um, Generally speaking, philosophy is about what's possible. It's about what's conceptually possible. What is Descartes really trying to do in the Meditations? He's trying to establish the possibility of a mathematical science, right? Now, that science barely existed. So he is trying to establish the possibility of something that is coming into existence. He wants to show that there's nothing conceptually wrong with it, and that we can legitimately continue in this vein. We can continue to develop mathematical science, right? Because it works. It's conceptually sound and possible, right? And he's getting in there right at the beginning when it's not really clear whether there can be a mathematical science. It's not clear whether it makes sense. So I believe Descartes sees himself as working with conceptual possibilities. I don't know what terminology he would use, but I think that's what he's doing. Now, more specifically, Dave says, look, once upon a time, Professor Rob, you were talking about David Hume's theory of morality, right? His theory of right and wrong. Now, Hume's theory of right and wrong depends heavily on moral sentiment, right? And, that sentiment gets cultivated over time, and we can use that sentiment. We can use well-cultivated moral sentiments to determine what's right and what's wrong, right? So, Gretchen Rob points out in class, apparently, a couple years ago maybe, it's possible that well-brought-up people think it's okay to torture babies. Now, I don't know what she said to back that up, but, let's say on the face of it, it's something we can imagine, right? And maybe we could work out a scenario, but I'm going to leave that to you, dear viewer. You work out a scenario in which well-brought-up people think that baby torture is okay, right? People are very malleable in their moral views and in their emotional reactions. And David Hume is trying to ground morality in these subjective impressions that people have, right? And especially, as I've said, in their moral sentiments. And so Professor Rob says, well, you can imagine people not having the right emotional reactions to baby torture. But baby torture is obviously wrong. That's a way of doing moral philosophy. I don't have qualms with it. You might wonder about it, you viewers out there. But we often do moral philosophy by starting with what we are pretty sure we know is true in ethics. We're pretty sure we know this is wrong. We're pretty sure we know this is right. So there's nothing unusual, at least, about Professor Rob insisting, well, we know baby torture is wrong. We know that, at least, right? And then, since David Hume is saying that morality depends on moral sentiments, and because according to Professor Rob, we can imagine people not really having the right emotional reactions to baby torture, it's not a credible view. It doesn't work. It's not okay, right? So Professor Rob was doing something along the lines of what Dave and Sam are trying to do, right? So they're trying to say, if the zombie world is possible, then physicalism is false. And Professor Rob was saying, well, if it's possible for it to turn out that baby torture is okay on David Hume's view of morality, then David Hume's view of morality is false, because we know baby torture is wrong. Okay, so that makes sense, right, as far as it goes. Okay, so Dave generalizes. I already made a general statement, but I'll follow Dave here. What does he say? Dave says that philosophy is generally supposed to tell us what is logically and conceptually possible, right? And that is a widely held view, right? Philosophers spend some time trying to distinguish what they're doing from what other academic people are doing, other scholars, right? And so we do need a sort of take on how what we're doing is different from what science is doing, right? Philosophers are interested in the truth. We're trying to get at the truth. Scientists, of course, are interested in the truth. So what's the difference? Well, it's a common view, at least, that philosophers are interested in these conceptual possibilities, right? And so we're coming at the truth, but we're coming at it through the lens of, can we construct a conceptual scheme that will get this to make sense? We're not directly looking at the data. That's the job of science. We want to look at the concepts and say, well, can we put these concepts together in a way that this account will make sense? This account of morality, or this account of subjective experience. Can we put the concepts together in a way that things will make sense for us, right? And you could see Socrates operating along these lines, right? We've been through the Euthyphro. What is Socrates really trying to get out of Euthyphro? Well, at least a consistent account of piety, right? There will be unanswered questions, even if he gets a consistent account, right? Because presumably piety has something to do with the gods, right? And then how are we going to access the gods? How are we going to ask the gods questions? How are we going to know what pleases them if that really has anything to do with piety, right? So we're trying to get this consistent account of things, right? And fitting it to the data is a different thing, right? And so then we philosophers think, well, that's the job of science, right? They're supposed to tell us how the world works. They're supposed to tell us what the world is like in very narrowly defined circumstances, right? Scientists are looking at causal factors that they can manipulate. And they often say, if we manipulate this causal factor so it has this value, then we'll get this result, right? So scientists work in possibilities too, right? According to what I just said, but these are narrowly defined, and they have to involve data. If we do this, if we make this manipulation, we'll get this result, right? And then of course they can have these highly abstract theories that depend on the manipulation of these microcausal factors, right? But for them, everything is answerable to the data, right? So there are similarities, obviously, in what philosophers and scientists are doing. But broadly speaking, philosophers are trying to work out certain conceptual possibilities, and that's the main thing they're doing. And scientists are trying to tell us what's going on in the actual world, especially in fairly well-defined circumstances, even though, again, they want to get a broad theory that fits all of that together. Okay, Well, I think all of that's true, right? And so there's nothing wrong with the way that Dave and Sam are proceeding to argue against physicalism. And Gretchen ultimately capitulates and says, yeah, okay, you're right. This is an okay method. All right, so what Gretchen wants to do at this point is she wants to get clear on consciousness, right? So what we're saying is there's this world full of zombies, and the zombies are physically just like us. They're physically indiscernible, but they lack consciousness, right? And so Gretchen wants to raise the question, well, what is consciousness, right? And so she uses the term or the phrase raw feels, which comes from Herbert Feigl, right? So there are these raw feels, I'm just holding this up. This is maybe interfering with the sound. I don't know. But I just want you to imagine stroking this a little bit, right? You can see how soft and spongy and squishy it is, right? There's a certain feel that you'll get from touching the microphone. There's a different kind of feel you'll get from rubbing this metal pen. This is a jotter. Different kind of feel you'll get touching these pages, these pieces of paper. Now, of course, we're not just talking about tactile sensations. There's a way that my voice sounds. I could make it lower. I could make it higher. I could do something weird with it. I don't know. There's some kind of way that, the sensations show up for you. And that's what we mean by raw feels. So we're talking about visual data and aural data, or in other words, audio data and tactile data, et cetera, right? Raw feels is very inclusive. It's not just tactile. Qualia is a word that philosophers use a lot, and it's just a synonym. Professor Rob isn't fond of the word. She says she's not sure how it's pronounced. Some people do say qualia. Qualia, I think I hear the most, so I'm going to go with that. So yeah, qualia are just, how it seems, how it appears. And then, of course, we get this reference to Thomas Nagel, who famously talks about what it's like to have certain experiences. So if we're trying to figure out what consciousness is, Professor Rob is starting out by saying, well, I think what we're talking about is raw feels, qualia, or the what it's like of experience. Okay. And then what it's like is something we can elaborate on quite a bit because of the work of Thomas Nagel. Now, he wrote a famous article called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" Right? And then what happens in that article? This was the 70s, by the way, if that matters, 1970s. That's close to when this conversation is actually supposed to have taken place. So Thomas Nagel notes that bats navigate their environment through echolocation, right? I think that's pretty well known. And that's why bats shriek, as you may or may not be aware. So they fly through the night, and they shriek, right? And so the sound bounces back from the environment. And the bats have very, very sensitive ears that allow them to determine how far away things are, depending on how the sound appears to them when it gets back to their ears, right? It's going to sound different if it bounces back after 6 feet than it does if it bounces back after 12 feet, right? If your ears are sensitive enough and your brain is set up to register that sensitivity, then you can tell the difference, right, between a sound that's coming back to you after 6 feet and one that's coming back to you after 12 feet. I don't know that I can do it, but a bat can do it. We have evidence indicating that a bat can do this. So, in fact, they do fly through the night. They do shriek. They do seem to form a map, a mental map of the environment from their shrieking and the way the shrieks are bouncing back at them from the environment, right? And so Nagel is raising the question, well, gosh, what is that like? Well, we don't know, and that's his answer, right? Obviously, we can hear things, and obviously we can navigate through the world, but generally speaking, I know there are exceptions. Humans navigate the world through sight, right? We have a map of the world, a spatial map of the world, and it's mainly built from what we see. Bats have a map of the world, a three-dimensional map of the world that they're navigating, and it's mainly built from what they hear, not from what they see, right? So that seems like such a big difference that we don't know what it's like to be a bat, right? So again, the title of the article is, what is it like to be a bat? And the answer is, certainly Nagel's answer is, well, we don't know. And then the interesting part is why we don't know. And it's because their experience is structured so differently, right? And so there's something it's like to be a bat, and there's something it's like to navigate the world through echolocation, and we don't know. There's something that it's like. There are facts about what it's like, but we don't know what it's like, right? All by itself, that kind of suggests that the mind is separate from the brain, which seems to be why Nagel was exploring it, right? He kind of thought, yeah, maybe subjective experience is just not physical and not really reducible to the physical, and he talks about this elsewhere. So we know that's the direction he was going in. But in the text, at this point in the text, what we're really doing is we're trying to get clear on what consciousness is, and so it's the what it's like aspect of, our being in the world. There's something it's like for us to be in the world and navigate the world, and the what it's like is what we mean by consciousness. Maybe that sounds weird, but that is what it makes sense, right? But you have to sort of have to grasp it from your point of view, because the what it's like is entirely subjective. That's the whole point here, right? It's something that you can access, but it's not objective. It's not there in the world as a thing, right? And so that's why I think this discussion is slightly awkward. I think you know what I mean, but we're not talking about a thing in the world that we could point to either. We're talking about what it's like. All right, and Locke gets mentioned. John Locke, you might know John Locke as a political philosopher, but he was also interested in metaphysics and epistemology. And he comes into it because he's very interested in self-consciousness. And so Professor Wyrob wants to mention that self-consciousness is different from consciousness, because they're trying to clarify what exactly the topic of discussion is. So John Locke talks about how we re-identify ourselves over time, which sounds weird, but in other words, what we do is we remember past incidents and we identify ourselves with the person who had the past experience of that incident. Um, in other words, to make it more concrete, I gave the Monday lecture last week. And so when I think back to giving the Monday lecture, I think of myself as the same person now who gave that Monday lecture a week ago, right? And, you know, a million years ago, not really, 6 weeks ago, 7 weeks, 6 weeks ago, I think it was 6 weeks ago, or so, I gave a lecture on what philosophy is, and I talked about the branches of philosophy, and I could think back to that, and I can remember what I talked about, and I think that's me, right? That's me in that memory. I'm doing that. So we re-identify ourselves over time. We collect experiences and we string them together, and we say, "That's me. That was me. That's me now. I did that. I'm doing this." That's just part of how human consciousness works. So the whole point of bringing it up is, well, that's different from the what it's like. So consciousness could mean what it's like. Consciousness could mean self-awareness, which involves re-identification over time. By the way, there's a Paul McCartney song, I believe it's called "That Was Me." It's in the album called "Memory Almost Full." So if you really want to think deeply about re-identification, listen to the song "That Was Me" on "Memory Almost Full" by Paul McCartney. You'll see what I mean. There's a lot of re-identification going on in that song. Okay. So ultimately, the point here is Professor Wyrob wants to focus on the what it's like. That's what the zombies are missing. Now, it takes her a while to get there. We haven't gone over everything she says to get there. But I have to say where we're going, I think, in order to orient you, right? So we've got these two definitions of consciousness, but the re-identification stuff, ultimately, it's not what we're worried about, right? What we're worried about is the raw feels, the what it's like. So eventually, Rob points out that dogs and frogs have qualia, we think, right? I mean, maybe we're not so sure about frogs, but yeah, probably they're similar enough. They have qualia, they have raw feels. Frogs probably don't have self-consciousness. They probably don't re-identify themselves over time. So we've got these two types of consciousness. The raw feels are necessary for human consciousness, but not sufficient, right? What does that mean? Well, like there is no consciousness without subjective experience. It's the baseline, right? We can't really talk about consciousness where there aren't any raw feels. But raw feels aren't sufficient for human consciousness either, because at least there's also self-awareness. There are probably other things as well that we could get into, but it's a little bit beside the point. What we're trying to do right now is we're trying to say consciousness at a base level, includes raw feels. There are other things going on. the raw feels are necessary for consciousness, but not sufficient, since there are other things going on. Okay. As Cohen points out, Dave Cohen, a human who is asleep and dreaming is conscious in the minimal sense, right? And then that minimal sense is what we're rejecting with respect to the zombies, right? And I don't know, this starts to seem like overkill, but Gretchen mentions robots in connection with this. If we need to make this even more clear, robots can navigate their environment. They have sensors that they can use to get through the environment. It would appear that they can re-identify themselves over time. I don't want to get into that too deeply, but you could give a robot a name, and certainly in theory, I don't know where we are right now with robot advancement exactly. But I know in theory we could give a robot a name, and the robot could say, I am Robbie, and last week I did this, and right now I'm working on your lawn. And that would sound like re-identification over time, and I wouldn't dispute it too fiercely. I think that's fair. And Gretchen certainly thinks it's fair. She says, look, robots can, you give them really souped up brains, maybe AI powered brains. Robots can analyze, robots can articulate, robots can perceive, robots can express states that they're in. I am damaged. So robots can do all these cognitively complicated things, but it's easy for us to say, well, they probably don't have experience. We don't really have good reason to say they have inner experience, right? So again, we're trying to figure out what's going on with the zombies, and finally where Gretchen ends up is, well, these zombies are like what we think robots are like, except the robots are made of silicon, mainly, perhaps. The zombies are made of carbon. They're carbon-based life forms. But other than that, we're kind of talking about the same thing. John Searle is mentioned here, and I don't want to get into Searle too much, but he's famous for the Chinese room argument, which is relevant here. When Searle tries to explain why computers can't think in the way that humans do, he comes up with this thought experiment of the Chinese room. So imagine we've locked someone in a room. We'll let them out eventually, don't worry. We've locked them in a room, and they've got a huge instruction manual, and it tells them, if you get these symbols, output these symbols, right? And people on the outside of the room are inputting Chinese characters, right? And then this person wants to get out of the room, poor person, and consults the instruction manual, and then outputs the symbols according to what the manual says. And then eventually I don't really think the person is being tortured in this scenario, but it's kind of funny. It kind of seems that way, and it amuses me. But anyway, this person is just following the instruction manual. The person gets this input and puts that output into these slots, and so they go, on the outside of the room. And so, okay, so there's a couple different perspectives here. People outside the room think they're asking questions in these Chinese characters, right? They're using the Chinese characters to ask questions. They're inserting the questions through the slots into the room. And then it seems to them they're getting answers, right? They input this question, they get this answer. So they figure the room knows the answer to the question. But the perspective on the inside of the Chinese room is, well, I got this character, and I have instructions to do this when I receive this character, and so I'll follow the instructions, and there we are, right? Or I got this set of characters, and the instruction manual says when these characters are put together in this way, do this, and so I do this, right? So the people outside the room have the impression that the room or something inside the room understands Chinese. But the person inside the room does not understand Chinese and is following instructions. And so Searle's point is, well, that's what computers do. We program them and they follow instructions. And so they don't understand, and so they don't think in the same sense that we do, because let's put it this way, the symbols don't have any reference for them. So when I say dog, that sort of resonates with my experience of lots of different dogs over time. Like, I actually interact with dogs in the real world. So that word is charged with a meaning that's based on, a lot of experience. Well, that's what the computer is lacking, right? It's lacking experience. It can manipulate symbols. It will manipulate them according to how we've programmed it to manipulate them, but it doesn't have an understanding of the symbols. There's syntax, but there's no semantics, right? Syntax is how we structure the symbols and what it means when we structure them this way rather than that way. Semantics is reference, right? The symbols don't refer from the computer's point of view. They refer from our point of view. We're the ones living in the world and engaging with things in the world, and the computers aren't, right? And this applies to current AI, even though, we don't program current AI in a linear way. Like, when Searle constructed the Chinese room thought experiment, that was the 80s. I'm pretty sure, yeah, it was the 80s, maybe even the early 80s. So now we train AIs on these huge sets of text, and it's a bit of a black box, but it's still the case that the symbols don't refer. I mean, if you understand how the AIs are trained, they're analyzing texts into chunks, little chunks, and then those chunks get numerical values, and then the AIs get used to doing certain numerical transformations, and so they do those transformations when you ask ChatGPT a question, and then that gets converted back to text. I mean, I'm sure I'm doing a sloppy job of this, but this is conceptually how it works. Again, chunks of texts getting numerical values, the AI getting used to doing certain numerical operations, does those kinds of numerical operations on whatever text you type in to ChatGPT or Claude or whatever it is, and then you get text back. I mean, that's conceptually what's going on. Right? And so there's no reference there. The AI doesn't have any experience of anything. So it's all association based. These words tend to go together, so I'm going to put them together. I mean, that makes it sound like the AI has agency, but nope, not yet. I would worry about that. Do we want AIs to have agency? I won't weigh in on that. I certainly worry about it. Okay. Anyway, where are we in this text? Well, I think we have finally clarified really exhaustively what the zombies don't have. They don't have experience, right? And we know what that means. And so, yeah, it's interesting to compare them to Searlean robots. And when I say Searlean robots, I'm making a reference to John Searle, who came up with the Chinese room argument, right? So I believe all of that makes sense. I hope it's helpful. Okay, so we've been able to say now in some detail what it means when we say that the zombie world is physically indiscernible from ours, right? These zombies are like carbon-based robots. They've got syntax, but they don't have semantics. There's input and there's output. There's analysis. Words are coming out of their mouth. Of course, I mean, physically indiscernible from our world, right? Words are coming out of their mouths. Those words seem to reflect some amount of cognition going on, right? And this all seems to make some sense, right? If robots that are good at analysis and, logical entailment in speech, if robots that are good at that could lack experience, which is what we think anyway, then it seems like there could be these zombies who are cognitively complex, who are going about their day doing complex things, and they could have no experience. That seems right. It seems conceivable. And again, the point is, well, look, if it's really possible, then physicalism is false. Because physicalism says that experience is physical, right? But if it's possible for there to be this physically indiscernible world that lacks experience, then experience can't be physical. So if there really can be this zombie world, if it really is conceivable, if it really is physically indiscernible, physicalism is false. Okay, well now that we've gotten clear on what experience is, not surprisingly, Gretchen Y. Robb wants to get clear on what the physical indiscernibility means. What does it really mean for the worlds to be physically indiscernible from each other? Okay, and then that's when she brings up the soup. And she asks Dave what he thinks of the soup. And Dave says it's delicious, right? And so she wants to make a big deal out of this point that Dave says the soup is delicious, presumably because he is experiencing the soup as delicious. Okay, so if you assume Dave is being honest, which, sometimes we say things taste good out of politeness, but assuming that Dave is being honest, he's had some raw feel in tasting the soup that is pleasant to him. That's part of the raw feel. So there's the taste of the soup, and then there's this sort of pleasantness imbued in that taste, right? And this is all very subjective, so he's having some kind of a subjective experience. And then Gretchen's point is, look, that's part of the cause of why you said delicious. That's the cause. That's one of the causes of your saying delicious when I asked you what the soup was like. Right. So now we get into this discussion of causation, right? Because do we want to say that the taste of the soup was the cause of Dave's calling it delicious, or do we want to say it was a cause, or what exactly do we want to say? Well, Gretchen says, look, there's this total cause of Dave calling the soup delicious. His tongue and mouth muscles were working. He was, in fact, disposed to tell the truth. Neither of those things have to do with raw feels. But then also, in addition to those things, he had an experience of the soup as delicious, right? So muscles working, taste buds working, physical stuff working, brain receiving signals from the tongue, brain able to send signals to the whole mouth, including the jaw and the lips, right, so that the words could be stated. So there's this complex causal story we can tell, and then the actual taste of the soup as delicious plays a role in that one big complex cause. So the way Gretchen ends up putting it is, the experience was a necessary part of the total conditions that were sufficient for Dave's calling the soup delicious. Okay. In order to fully understand the point about the soup, what Gretchen is trying to say about the soup, we need to talk a little bit more about necessary and sufficient conditions. Those came up earlier, but we need to go into more detail here. So one approach we can take is we can think about Socrates' statement that the unexamined life is not worth living for human beings. Notice the double negation there, unexamined, not worth living. If we don't examine our lives, they're not worth living. That indicates that examination is a necessary condition. Without examination, we won't get a valuable life. As I often tell my students, that's different from saying examination is sufficient. Socrates wouldn't be saying something very plausible if he said examination was sufficient. Now, the way you would state a sufficient condition in this context is you would say, if you examine your life, it will be worth living. That's not what Socrates said. It's clearly not anything he believed, right? Remember the discussion about corruption. You could corrupt your body, right? And then life wouldn't be worth living. You could corrupt your soul, and then life wouldn't be worth living. So yeah, so you could be in chronic pain, terrible chronic pain, and then you could maybe manage to examine your life through the pain. Well, it still wouldn't be worth living, according to Socrates' own statements, taking them as a whole. So examination isn't sufficient. It's necessary. When we state a necessary condition, we're saying without that condition, the outcome we're interested in won't occur. When we state a sufficient condition, we're saying, with the condition, the outcome we're interested in will occur. Are these really different, you might think? Think about it in terms of money, if that helps. Sometimes I try this with my logic students. So in order to have $100, in order to have $100, it's necessary that I have 10. I can't get to 100 without getting to 10. 100 is 10 sets of 10, right? It's necessary that I have 10. But then having 10 isn't sufficient for having 100 either, right? Because I need 10 sets of 10. If I have just one set of 10, if I just have 10, that's not 100. So to have $100, it's necessary to have 10, but having 10 isn't sufficient for having 100, right? Now, having $100 is sufficient for having 10, but then again, having $50 is sufficient for having 10, and having $40 is sufficient for having 10, and so on, right? So necessary and sufficient conditions are importantly different. If a condition is necessary, you can't get around it. You won't get the outcome without having the condition satisfied. It won't happen. But if something is sufficient, $100 is sufficient to get 10, there are other ways to get the outcome, right? This one's sufficient, but some other one could be sufficient. Okay. That should make sense as far as it goes. So what's the point about the soup? Well, the point about the soup is it is a necessary part of some set of conditions that are sufficient for Dave's saying delicious, right? When Gretchen asks him, what do you think of the soup? He says delicious. Okay, so to take that even farther, we get this notion of an innis condition, which is complicated, admittedly. An innis condition is an insufficient but necessary part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition. So Dave's experience of the soup as delicious is insufficient, but it's necessary within the context in which it occurred, at least. The context in which it occurred is his mouth really was working, his taste buds were working, the brain was connected to everything in the appropriate way, he was disposed to tell the truth and not lie. In that context, his having an experience of the soup as delicious was necessary to his saying that word, delicious. Okay, so looking at the whole innis condition, insufficient but necessary part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition. In other words, there's this cluster of conditions that we're calling the sufficient condition. There's some other set that would be sufficient as well, and this is how sufficient conditions work in general. What if Dave's taste buds weren't working because he had a cold or because some nerves were severed? What if he can't taste anything, right? That's a possible scenario. And then in this alternate scenario, he's not disposed to tell the truth. Let's say he has a cold, he can't taste things very well, and then he's disposed to lie to be polite. He figures, well, what's the harm? I can't taste anything anyway. Probably her soup is delicious. She's made delicious things for me before, so I'll just go ahead and lie, even though I can't taste anything. So here's some other set of conditions that's sufficient. His finding the soup to be delicious plays no role there, right? It doesn't matter whether he finds the soup delicious in this alternate scenario, right? So there's some other complex sufficient condition where Dave's finding the soup delicious isn't necessary, right? So that's why we say his actually experiencing the soup as delicious is an insufficient but necessary part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition, right? It's not necessary, this cluster in which everything is working well and he's disposed to tell the truth isn't necessary, it's sufficient. It's not necessary because here's this other scenario where things aren't working properly because he has a cold, and now he's disposed to lie because he wants to be polite and he has a cold and he can't taste anything anyway. So he'll just go ahead and say it's delicious. So there are different clusters of factors which are sufficient. One of them gets actualized. In the one that's actual, in the one that got actualized, his finding the soup delicious plays a necessary role. In that cluster, he's disposed to tell the truth. So then he has to actually find the soup delicious. That's necessary for him to say the word delicious. But the whole cluster is only sufficient, not necessary. There are alternate scenarios that are possible here. So his finding the soup delicious is insufficient but necessary. It's an insufficient but necessary part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition. That should make some sense by now. I hope I'm trying for you here. The example in the text is of this train that gets derailed. Why does it get derailed? Well, a wheel falls off the boxcar. Okay, well, that's part of a cluster of factors. As they say in the text, okay, the train was going really fast and it went around, it's going really fast and it went around a curve, and this wheel had come off the boxcar. Okay, so that was enough. Those conditions together were sufficient for the train to be derailed, right? So the wheel coming off the boxcar is an insufficient but necessary part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition. In other words, there are other ways trains get derailed, right? The train going fast around a curve with a wheel missing from a specific boxcar, that's sufficient, but it's not necessary, right? There's this alternate scenario in which somebody removes part of the track. They just remove a piece of the track. Well, that'll do it. Now, in that other scenario, where somebody removes a piece of the track, it doesn't matter whether there's a wheel missing, right? But in the cluster that gets actualized, in the cluster of factors that actually occurred, the train was going fast, it went around a curve, there was a wheel missing. The wheel missing was necessary, right? The train is designed to go fast around curves. Something had to go wrong for the train to get derailed, right? So in this scenario that actually occurred, we're supposing the wheel coming off the boxcar was a necessary factor. It was a necessary part of a sufficient condition, but that sufficient condition wasn't necessary. And that's what innis, again, that's what it means. The wheel coming off was an insufficient, right? We needed the speed and the going around the curve too. So the wheel coming off is not sufficient. It's an insufficient but necessary part of this cluster. And this cluster is unnecessary but sufficient. And the whole cluster is unnecessary because of the, hey, somebody removed a piece of the track scenario. Or somebody like set off a bomb under the train, right? That could make it derail. Different scenarios that are sufficient, and because there are different ones that are sufficient, no one of them is necessary. No one set of factors is necessary. But within a certain cluster, the wheel falling off seems to be necessary there. Okay, I think we get it. I think we understand. So then I think we can agree that Dave's finding the soup to be actually delicious experientially, like having a raw feel of the soup as delicious, we can agree that that's an innis condition, right? In the cluster of factors that we've mentioned before, he everything's working properly. He's disposed to tell the truth. It's necessary that he find the soup to actually be delicious. It's not sufficient, but it's a necessary part of that whole cluster of conditions that we're calling sufficient. Okay, well, what does that tell us then? What does that tell us? Well, it would seem to tell us that there's a problem with physical indiscernibility here, right? If Dave's finding the soup delicious is really an innis condition for his saying the word delicious, right? And then we have that zombie world where zombie Dave says the soup is delicious. It's not physically indiscernible because we don't know what caused zombie Dave to say the soup is delicious. Here, in our world, it was the taste of the soup that acted as an innis condition. So what's going on there? We're saying here it's an innis condition, which means it's a necessary part of the cluster. Over in the zombie world, we're saying that necessary piece is missing from the cluster. So why is Dave saying the soup is delicious? Okay, well, Sam has an answer. It's not a good answer. Ultimately, Sam agrees it's not a good answer. But he does have an answer, right? So he ends up embracing Epiphenomenalism, even though he doesn't actually initially know what that word means. In other words, what he says is, well, maybe the raw feel of the deliciousness of the soup doesn't play the role that we think it does, even in our world. So it certainly could be that when Dave says delicious in our world, the causes there don't include the deliciousness of the soup. The causes in our world might not include the deliciousness of the soup. And then the deliciousness of the soup doesn't need to play a role in the zombie world. Well, how would that work? Well, the idea is Dave tastes the soup and it causes his brain to react in such a way that the brain causes the mouth to say the word delicious. And then at the same time, simultaneously, same input causes his brain to have an experience of deliciousness, but the experience of deliciousness plays no role in what's coming out of his mouth. There's a bifurcation. So the input is the soup and the data from the taste buds, and that goes to the brain, and then the brain does two things. The brain causes the word delicious to come out of the mouth, and the brain causes an experience of deliciousness. But the experience of deliciousness, that raw feel, isn't causing Dave to say delicious. It's as if he's robotically saying delicious, and then at the same time he's being caused to have an experience of deliciousness. That's basically epiphenomenalism. the idea of epiphenomenalism is, well, sure, we have experiences, but they don't cause anything further to happen, right? My conscious experiences, we could call them metaphysical danglers. They're just dangling there. They don't do anything. They're like froth on the ocean. You know, the waves of the ocean crash down on the ground, on the rocks, and you get some froth. The froth doesn't do anything. It's just a superficial thing added on top. So epiphenomenalism is saying that's what experience is. It's this superficial thing sitting on top of what's happening, and it has no efficacy of its own, right? So Gretchen points out that Sam is embracing, or seems to be embracing, epiphenomenalism, right? And Dave explains what it is, which I just did for you. There is some evidence, as is discussed in the text, that epiphenomenalism is true, right? So when you touch a hot stove, you react so quickly, you pull your hand back so quickly that we think we've determined that the pain can't be the cause of you retracting your hand. So maybe it's always like this. Sam is willing to entertain this in the text. Maybe it's always like this. You touch the hot stove, your nervous system determines that the stove is too hot and that you need to retract your hand. And so that happens robotically, let's say. But at the same time, that same data that caused you to retract your hand makes its way to the brain and causes an experience of pain. So it seems to you that the pain is causing you to retract your hand, but the timing doesn't seem right when we measure these things in a lab. Okay, so the pain there is an epiphenomenon, right? The pain doesn't help you retract your hand. It just comes after the fact. So it seems like, oh, I took my hand away because it was so painful, but that doesn't seem to be correct. It seems like you had a reaction to the hot stimulus. So the hot stimulus caused the retraction, and it caused an experience of pain, but the pain didn't cause anything. The pain didn't cause you to retract your hand. The pain just is itself. It doesn't lead anywhere. Not in the moment. Okay. So Gretchen tells us what's appealing about epiphenomenalism, helpfully, on page 42. I guess I haven't been mentioning page numbers much, but if you want to know, Gretchen tells us what's great about epiphenomenalism on page 42. She says it allows us to accommodate these three things that seem plausible. Number one, epiphenomenalism allows us to be property dualists, right? Experiences are non-physical events caused by the brain. Absolutely, that's fine, right? In that scenario in which I retracted my hand, we can say that the experience of pain there is non-physical, and that's fine. That works out, right? Especially since the pain isn't having further effects, so that works out really well, right? So we don't know how non-physical things cause physical things to happen. We don't need to know that if we're epiphenomenalists, right? That pain doesn't need to do anything in the scenario, right? The nervous system is causing the brain to have an experience, and the nervous system is causing the hand to retract. We don't need the experience to do anything. It's a dangler. Number 2, physical events in our brain determine which experiences we have. These aren't just random correlations, right? This particular brain state caused this particular experience. That checks out, right? So again, in the hot stove scenario, there was a hot stimulus that affected my nervous system in a certain way. This had a certain impact on my brain, which caused me to have an experience of pain. If something different happened to my nervous system, I'd have a different experience. So we get property dualism. We get some kind of tight connection between what's actually happening in the brain and the kind of experience I'm having. And then 3, we have long thought that the physical world is a closed causal system. That is to say, if we're wondering what the cause of some physical event is, we look in the physical world. So epiphenomenalism preserves that. If property dualism is true, and we're not epiphenomenalists, then we're saying that there are non-physical properties of the brain that are causing things to happen in the world, and that's a little spooky, right? So we've long thought the physical world is a closed causal system, right? And so epiphenomenalism is allowing us to say that. It's allowing us to combine property dualism with a tight connection between what's happening in the brain and what kind of experience we're having. And we're putting that together with, the physical world as a closed causal system, so that there aren't any non-physical causes of physical things. We don't like that. It's spooky. We don't know how to do science if that's happening, right? So Gretchen explains all of that. Okay, so with epiphenomenalism in place, clearly we can get the zombie world to be physically indiscernible from our world, right? If we take epiphenomenalism for granted, the way we've just explained it, when experiences are metaphysical danglers and they don't have any further effects, if we grant that that's true, then we can grant that when Dave says delicious, his finding the soup delicious experientially is not an innis condition of his saying that word, right? And so now the cause of his saying delicious is the same in both worlds. So when Dave says the soup is delicious in our world, it's as if the stimulation of the taste buds is somewhat directly causing him to say that. He says it in a robotic way while having a non-physical experience of the soup as delicious, right? And then the zombie world, it's the same. His taste buds are causing him to say in a robotic way, delicious, and then there is no metaphysical dangler. There is no experience sitting on top of that, like the froth on the ocean. Got it? Okay, so I think we could understand then why Gretchen would say, no, I don't accept epiphenomenalism. She has to concede at this point that if epiphenomenalism is true, then everything works out. If epiphenomenalism is true, then there is possibly a zombie world that's physically indiscernible from our own world, and then that makes physicalism false for reasons we've already gone over a couple of times, right? So we won't go over it again. It's just that, if there's a zombie world with no experience and it's really physically indiscernible from ours, then physicalism has to be false, right? And then if we grant epiphenomenalism, we can get that to work. And then Gretchen says, I can't accept epiphenomenalism. It's too high a price to pay to get property dualism. Why can't she accept epiphenomenalism? Well, if she accepts epiphenomenalism, then when she says delicious, it's not because the taste of the soup is delicious. When she invites her friends over for lunch to discuss philosophy, it's not because she enjoys it. More broadly, experiences are disconnected from what's actually happening. So my concern, Gretchen doesn't make a big deal out of this, but my main concern with epiphenomenalism is, well, it seems to me that I do things because of my intentions, right? And often when we're talking about moral merit or blame, we talk about intentions. Well, I intended to do this. Now, this happened as a result, but this was my intention, and we tend to think intention matters. So we tend to think, we act on our intentions cause us to do what we do. When we're assessing merit and blame, as I said, we look at what the intentions were. Epiphenomenalism says that intentions don't actually do anything. So, Gretchen seems to, I don't know, maybe I'm not, maybe I'm misinterpreting her a little bit. I don't know. It seems to me like she and Dave focus on enjoyment and pleasure and pain, and that's fine. I do think, I would like it to be the case that my pleasures and pains have some influence on how I behave, but I personally am actually more concerned that my intentions matter, right? It's not that my intentions float free of what I'm doing and how I behave, but that's the epiphenomenalist picture. My intentions are one thing. It's like a separate realm, and then my behavior is another thing. It's robotic. It's automatic, right? I think my intentions rather are causing me to behave in certain ways, but epiphenomenalism says it's false. Okay. So that actually is a pretty good place to stop. If it matters, Dave also chimes in and says epiphenomenalism is a bridge too far. But it's for the same reasons that Gretchen stated, more or less, certainly that I've stated in explaining Gretchen's position. Epiphenomenalism is too much because if we accept epiphenomenalism, our experiences float free of the causal realm. So in a way they're not real, which is not what Dave and Gretchen say. That's not how they put it. But I think that's fair, right? If real things have efficacy, which is not a bad criterion for reality, if real things have efficacy, then our experiences aren't real on this field. I'm not saying they don't happen at all, but I am saying they're like the froth on the ocean that I mentioned. They don't do anything. That's what I mean by efficacy. Something is efficacious. Something has efficacy if it can accomplish something, if it leads to something. So there's some sense in which experience isn't real if epiphenomenalism is correct. It's a metaphysical dangler. It's superficial. It's got no substance. I don't know how else to put it. I just want to be blunt and say, well, there's a sense in which experience isn't real. Then it doesn't do anything on this picture. Okay, so Gretchen summarizes on page 46. There, I gave you a second page number, if that helps. Her summary is basically, if epiphenomenalism is true, then the zombie world is possible. So she's conceding that. She's conceding that under certain conditions, the zombie world is possible, which of course would make physicalism false. However, if epiphenomenalism is not true, then removing experiences from the zombie world removes some of the causes of the physical events in our world. Then those events should be missing from the zombie world so that it is not physically indiscernible from ours. Right? And then, of course, Gretchen finds epiphenomenalism wildly implausible. So her view is, to be more specific, Dave's actually finding the soup delicious experientially is an inner condition of his saying delicious. And that's missing from the zombie world. And so the zombie world is not physically indiscernible from ours. And so we don't need to reject physicalism. Okay, thanks.